first of all, I'd just like to welcome everybody to today's Agile surgery. We're going to be focusing on DevOps. We're going to be covering off what DevOps is, what it means to us as BJSS, and also what it means to our clients as well. Before we get into any of that, we're just going to quickly introduce you to our panel. I'm going to start off by introducing myself. My name's Kev Savage. I'm a business analyst with BJSS. I've been at BJSS now for just over 18 months.
I'm Ollie. I'm a test leader at BJSS. I've been here for 2 years and also a squad lead.
Thanks, Ollie. My name is Mario. I'm a delivery manager, agile coach and capability lead for the Midlands. So I've been at BJSS for a couple of years now. I work on a public sector project, and in my spare time, I'm a bit of a kind of amateur developer. So it's good to see you all.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a DevOps strategy consultant here at BJSS. I've been here about a year, and my background is mainly in platform and systems engineering. But I've done pretty much every job you can think of in the SDLC. So it's given me a lot of opinions.
Okay, great. So that's going to be the panel who's going to keep you entertained today and this evening. So before we just do that, I'm going to quickly sort of talk you through, just quickly introduce you to BJSS. So first of all, obviously, who we are and what we do. So we like to sort of try to understand sort of our clients' businesses through deep experience in sort of the industries they work in, our services, and through talented people. So what does that actually mean? So we build dynamic technology platforms that millions of people use every day. We have over 2,000 talented people across the country, across different continents, who combine sort of deep industry insight with engineering excellence. We complete end-to-end capabilities from strategy all the way through delivery and into managed services. So really sort of full life cycle delivery there. We have a strong pedigree in enabling innovation. So including areas such as cloud, AI data, and automation. And in addition to delivery of our services, we provide added value through ongoing dedicated account management that's linked to our customers' goals. All our work is underpinned by our proven enterprise agile delivery approach. So what does this actually mean? We make digital transformation and user engagement a reality. Just to kind of show sort of BJSS as a company and overall, sort of we're growing. We've got an international focus company. So on the slide deck here, it just focuses kind of where we are across not only the UK, Europe, also North America, Australasia as well. Okay, so we've kind of today what we're just going to briefly cover off now. So we've done an introduction into the panel. We're going to sort of then go into the slide deck, going to cover off kind of sort of client needs during COVID-19 for DevOps. Then going to cover off what DevOps is, the current state of DevOps, a DevOps case study, and what does DevOps actually mean to the panel itself. We're also going to have time for Q&A at the end. So for anybody within the room, please take note of any questions and stuff like that, and we'll go around the room, try and answer those questions. We will also, for anybody who's joining us online, please feel free to type any questions in. If you can sort of make sure that they're just sent to everybody so we can pick them up, and then we'll also discuss those later as well. Okay, so we're just going to I'm going to hand you over to Ollie to get you into what DevOps is and what it means for us. So over to you, Ollie.
Thank you. There's some pictures of us, but we already introduced ourselves. So I'm going to talk to you about client needs during COVID-19. And before we get into anything DevOps related, I want to talk to you a little bit about who BJSS are. Obviously, Kevin has just done an excellent introduction. It's important that we've been doing this for almost 30 years, and that we're located in many locations across the globe. However, there's a couple of bits that I think are more important than that I want to hone in on. A couple of our values that we've had ever since we started: collaboration with our clients and forming long-term relationships with our clients. This is nothing new. It's been something that's been important to us since we started, but I think in the current business climate, it's more important than ever. We've moved from not just being an excellent technology supplier, but also to being a higher level strategic partner with many of our clients. So what does this actually mean? It means that not only are we solving, complex technical problems, but we're also consulting on the business and organizational changes required to support these implementations. So it's from that perspective that I want to talk about some of the issues that we deal with our clients. It's also, I think, important to highlight that when we take on this work, we're often doing it under pressure and under tight timelines. And it's very important for us to be able to respond to change. And it'd be disingenuous to talk about the state of DevOps in 2021 without talking about the state of the world in 2021, when we've all had to respond very quickly to change in the pandemic. Now, obviously, over the last 18 months, we've all been responding to these great changes in the world. I say great as in large, not great as in actually great. But I'm not going to focus on the sort of global ramifications of the pandemic and more about what it's meant for our industry. And to summarize, it's been a great boom for our industry. We've also seen lots of trends that were creeping into the mainstream, such as tech-first businesses and the rise of remote working suddenly become mainstream. Our clients have had to adapt very quickly. UX and performance have become more important than ever. We've also seen businesses that had an in-store high street focus that, of course, are already feeling the pressure of Amazon online shopping, have to respond very quickly to this remote world. Internally too, as an industry, we've had to adapt. Scrum teams that were shouting about the benefits of co-location were suddenly forced to work remotely for the past 18 months. And whilst, this had a lot of benefits, and for the most part, it's been a resounding success due to great tooling and, mostly due to the adaptability and effort of our industry's workforce. It's my opinion that we're starting to see some of the longer term consequences of remote working. Here at BGSS, we're lucky. We have an excellent hybrid working model that works really well for both us and our clients. And I've really enjoyed the move away from office-based projects to a more global workforce. I get to work with people from Lisbon and New York, for example, which I love, but not every business is in our position. And we know that because we work with them. So given the ramifications of COVID, what do we do? So to be honest, our work in terms of what we do has remained largely the same. It's the surrounding context that has really changed in this pandemic. We found that businesses have needed to respond really quickly to these changes. Something that I just had to check there because it's a great phrase and I like to use it, is pandemic-induced digital transformation. Didn't want to get that wrong. We've seen the pressures and the conditions created by COVID really have emphasized the importance of agility and speed of response. These things were important before, but I think now more so than ever that they've been highlighted. I think also we're seeing that businesses that really push the boat out to stay afloat during COVID now need to understand how they can do that sustainably. Also, coming back to the point on where we consult on technology issues, but also organizational business changes, the line now between how you operate as a business and how you operate your technologies is more blurred than ever. Now, we've always dealt with tough problems, whether it's legacy tech or whether it's years and years of technical debt that has become very painful to repay. We're used to dealing with that. But along with these legacy tech issues, we also have legacy way of working issues, legacy organizational structures that just aren't fit for the modern world. And then these are really tough problems to solve, especially in large organizations where, the changes would be sweeping and drastic, and they can be difficult for those organizations to adapt to. On that last point as well, that structural debt, we can often find that departments that are very siloed off from each other can form their own subcultures. And whilst that's not a bad thing in itself, and you want those places to have the ability to express themselves, when those places are very siloed and they don't interact with each other for too long across, say, the formation of an idea to a product, when they do inevitably come into contact, there can be conflict. And if you can find that those different departments, if left by themselves for too long, have their own goals and motives, and compared to what might be the overarching business goal, there can be a bit of conflict there. In the end, it comes down to simple physics. If all of your moving parts aren't pulling in the same direction, you're not going as fast as you could be. So with all that in mind, what do we do and how do we make sure that our clients keep up?
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's framed all the stuff that I want to say really well. Thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to sit here and talk about DevOps, because that's my favourite thing in the world. And I'm very conscious that we've got quite a lot of very, very experienced practitioners listening in today. And we've got a few people who just want to know what it's all about as well. And so the reason I'm particularly happy about that is because it gives me the chance to sort of go back to basics a little bit and think about what the fundamentals of DevOps are, why we're doing it. And I'm hoping that even the most jaded of you will find something that makes you go, oh yeah, I'll think about that. So here goes. I think as a consultancy, we often start with a problem. So let's start with what DevOps isn't to begin with. First of all, it's not a tool. Now, one of my absolute favorite tools or suite of tools in the whole world was originally marketed as DevOps in a box. Now, of course, DevOps does not fit in a box. DevOps is not a tool. You know, it happens to be a very, very fine suite of tooling that does, you know, it underpins DevOps practices very well. But yes, DevOps is not a tool. And it doesn't matter if you put that in the name of the tool. It's not just dev. It's something that we find time and time again as well. DevOps is a grassroots movement at its very start. And we often find there's pockets of really good practice. And a lot of those pockets are often just in the dev world. We need to keep reminding ourselves that it's DevOps. We are, to be honest, you've probably heard things like DevSecOps, DevSecTestOps, etc. Now, DevOps already includes absolutely everybody in the whole organization. And DevOps is not a job title. That can be a very nice way of forcing one person to do all of the dev, the deployment, the running it in ops. And it's great to get engineers involved in all of the things that take to deliver a product. However, forcing someone to do all the things all the time, it's not safe, it's not ethical, it's not fair on that person, and it's not scalable. You know, you can't overstretch people long term, and you know, the more there is to do, the more you need to scale out your workforce. And of course, DevOps is not, as we say in the title of this talk, ever done. It is about continuous improvement. And the minute you start thinking it's done, you need to start thinking about what DevOps is again. Every day we have new regulations, particularly around sustainability, and we need to address those. Maybe we need to include that in our definition of what's awesome. Maybe we think of new ideas all the time. Maybe we look at ways of improving. DevOps is not ever done, and continuous improvement is never done. Believe it or not, there was a time before DevOps. And in this world, there were lots of different really good management theories and ways of working out there. The one that was affecting our world of software delivery most was the Agile movement. And Agile was helping us to move from doing quite clunky long-term project delivery and moving to a much more flexible product delivery team model. It was putting the value that you produce by delivering software above creating loads of documentation. It was putting people and ideas above sort of processes and Gantt charts and stuff like that. And so it was actually increasing the pace of software delivery really well, and it was actually increasing the happiness as well. And of course, that's, you know, happy people who find joy in their everyday work are just going to do a better job. However, what we found, again, grassroots movement, it was in pockets throughout different organizations. And even though there was good practice in certain places, and even though Agile teaches us that you should get your entire product delivery stream together, there was always a clash between dev and ops. And when we look at this little diagram here, we've got dev on the left-hand side. They're doing all their work, they're making changes, and without really briefing ops properly, they're just chucking their work over this wall to ops who are trying to deal with it. And that wall in the middle is often referred to as the wall of confusion, because it wasn't actually about dev sort of pelting missiles at ops or ops being sort of mean to dev. It was really about the way they're incentivized. Developers and development teams, of course, they are incentivized to make changes. That's their entire reason for existing. And all they want to do is do the amazing coding and build the thing and get it out into life. Ops, however, they are incentivized to keep everything stable. They don't want anything to break. They don't want any downtime. And if there is any downtime, they're going to have the punishment of those 2 a.m. phone calls, you know. So you can really understand the reason there's this big divide between dev and ops, despite agile being a thing. So, yeah. There was a will to work together and get rid of this wall, get rid of the confusion, get rid of the conflict. And in 2008, actually at an Agile conference in Toronto, there were certain conversations and presentations that gave birth to the idea of DevOps. Within months, there was actually an online movement, and the first DevOps Days event was held in Belgium. That is the origin of the term DevOps. It's not actually an industry buzzword at all. It's some guys who are devs, some people who are ops, getting together in a room and trying to work out these differences. So DevOps thinking, despite my background in engineering, the thinking behind DevOps is the most important thing. And I wanted to focus on this today, not just because it's so revolutionary, but because it doesn't just apply to software development. I've talked this through with people in lots of different industries, lots of different roles. I've done it with IT people, lots. It really applies very, very well there. Done it with nurses, I've worked on it with HR teams. These ways of thinking are actually applicable to almost anything. Also, your thinking is your own. You can sit down anytime with your team and say, right, we're gonna go through this and we're gonna think about it, we're gonna focus our continuous improvement efforts on the 3 ways of DevOps. I'm going to just go into each one of them quite quickly for you and just see what you think about how you could apply these to your day-to-day work. So the first way is systems thinking, and you're emphasizing the performance of the entire system. So you've got this sort of godlike view of everything that it takes to get your product from the moment there's an idea to being live value for your customer at the other end. And you think, okay, well, yeah, no, I know all about that. It's not until you actually get people who are involved in that entire value stream from idea to live, get them all together in a room and actually map out what all the steps are, map out what all the problems are in the system. And once you've mapped out all the problems, get in there and think about all the solutions or ideas or hackathons you might like to do, all the improvements, you know. Having understood the flow, you can always seek to increase it, improve the performance because you're aware of it. And if there's a problem somewhere, you don't have to allow it to persist because you know exactly who to talk to about it, and you probably know exactly what to do. You can all get together and swarm that problem and get rid of it from your system. And if you get somebody who's getting really enthusiastic and making improvement just in their bit, and it's obviously going to cause some sort of problem elsewhere, you can all get together with trust and respect and understanding and just sort of encourage them to maybe do it a little bit of a different way. So that's the first way. The second way of DevOps is to shorten and amplify feedback loops. So this could be anything any of your stakeholders might want to know. It might be your operational metrics. It might be information about how your team's working, any sort of flow of knowledge. You want to know that you're going to get feedback on anything you do. In fact, once you establish what you think is a great feedback loop, seek feedback on your feedback, because you know you can, using agile iterative methods, you can keep improving the loops themselves. So understand your stakeholders. Once you've done your value stream mapping in the first way, you'll probably realize that there are more stakeholders than you even realized. Understand exactly what it is they want to know. Think about what you want to know and make sure that that's available. hopefully in a self-service way if possible, but it could be just a cadence of meetings, talking to the right people, getting together regularly. Capturing the right metrics also means that when you're doing your continuous improvement work, you can map that improvement, you can actually prove that improvement. And I think that will be really, really powerful, particularly if you're trying to do all this good DevOps stuff in your area of the business and you've got a few crossed arms elsewhere, maybe the C-level execs, maybe the CEO, they're also thinking, why are they wasting their time with this? Prove it. And just facilitate sharing. That's the second way. The third way, a culture of continual experimentation and learning. So this is about understanding that experimentation, learning, taking risks, success and failure are all benefits to your team. Making time to do this sort of activity within your day-to-day work, creating a sense of safety that rewards risk-taking, learning as a team, you know, if there's a success, fantastic, you're all involved. If there's a failure, fantastic, you're all involved. You're still learning from it either way. And I know Mario is going to talk in a little bit about some of the sorts of tooling and stuff like that that you can put in to underpin these ideas. And creating really good delivery processes, having a really robust route to live with lots of good automated testing in it, that creates safety, which allows you to do this sort of experimentation and learning. So, and yeah, make the time, make it regularly, because by repetition and practice, that's how you'll actually succeed. So I've mentioned a few things while I've been talking about the 3 ways, about how everybody's well-being is promoted and augmented by thinking this way, thinking in a DevOps way and acting in a DevOps way. So having that joy in your everyday work, understanding the well-being of everyone, being really flexible. If somebody needs to do something a bit different, we can flex, we can sort that out. That's not a problem. Well-being is key. And of course, in a lot of industries at the moment, there are sustainability regulations coming in, say banking, pharma, healthcare, construction. There are new sustainability regulations coming in all the time at the moment. It's no longer a nice to have, it is actually necessary. And if you are thinking in the 3 ways, you will naturally be able to adapt to those regulations and exceed them. And that feedback with action is very important, particularly, let's give an example. If you are delivering a web service and you've got continuous feedback from your users, you can understand what accessibility means to every single one of those users, and you can flex to make sure that you're delivering something which is useful to everybody, benefits everybody. With that, let me just pass over to Mario, who's going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the other aspects of DevOps.
Thanks, Alex. That was absolutely brilliant. So yeah, both Ollie and Alex have really covered so many really good points that I'm going to try and unpack just a little bit more. And we're going to start just by showing you a diagram of, as a delivery manager, what we try and do and what I try and do when we talk to C-level executives and try and get them to understand both the notion of some of the things that Alex has talked about from a cultural and a sustainability perspective, but also from a practical engineering perspective, the kind of stuff that Ollie's mentioned. So I'm going to assume no knowledge and just re-baseline and calibrate what DevOps is. And it's 3 things. There's the continuous integration and the continual development thing, right? And they all came in order. So it's continuous integration. That was a thing, as Alex mentioned earlier, typically pre-2000, projects were big, monolithic waterfall. They'd do all the requirements up front. They'd then pass it to an engineering team. The engineering team would be massive. And then they'd kind of work it out as they go, do testing at the end. And you've read all the headlines about, you know, projects being over time, over budget, that kind of thing. So Sun Microsystems were one of the first companies that developed an integration tool called Hudson that is now, for the engineers amongst us, you'll know as Jenkins. And that was the attempt to get in a disparate and partly remote engineering team to contribute to this notion of a master branch. So everyone works remotely but contributes to a whole product. You've then got the delivery thing, which kind of came a little bit after, or at least at the same time. So these companies are now, they've got the hang of delivering software a little bit better, but now they want to do it quicker. And Alec mentioned the wall of confusion, and you can see on the diagram there that this really was kind of a nexus for organizations that all of a sudden were experiencing problems. They were building product, they were throwing it over the wall to operators, and operators can be your customers, or they can be your internal workforce. So think about if you work at a company and your internal systems are terrible in comparison to what you serve to your customers. And that's a classic example of afterthought for your internal teams. So we see this even now, and we were talking about it just before we came on to do the talk, that organizations still have this problem of the build is so separate from the actual organization. And what DevOps and the kind of melding of it is to try and bring the operational side of the business together with the engineering team and make it work as a whole. So about 2009, if I get his name right, Patrick Du Bois, he coined the term DevOps, which was this notion of, well, let's take the engineering bit and let's take the business operations bit and let's work on that kind of, you'll see the kind of infinity loop of the development, the test, the build, but also thinking about the planning and the users and bringing it all together. And then we augment over the top kind of the agile stuff. We borrow from lean, from industry and manufacturing. And as we have these talks with our clients, what we realize is there's quite a lot of gaps in certainly the C-level executives understanding and taking on board what engineers go through to build product. So the bottom bit of the diagram talks about the use of automation and automation tools and how we can use them. We'll talk a little bit in a sec about observability and some of the things that we're seeing certainly over the next kind of 12, 24 months. But that's a really good diagram, because what we try and do hopefully is bring, and to summarize, DevOps is this three things. It's the engineering element, the continuous integration, the continuous delivery, but it's also a cultural element as well. And Ollie and Alex have both talked about how companies see themselves, what they deliver, and if they're actually delivering software, are they doing it and thinking about the users first? So this next slide's a few stats just around sort of cloud adoption, and it's really important that cloud adoption and DevOps kind of goes side by side. And Ollie used a really interesting term, sort of post-pandemic transformation. So at BJSS, we see companies and our clients in 1 or 2, 3 states maybe of transformation. They've either done it and they're kind of thinking, well, where's the cost realization? Where's the savings? Where's the benefit? They're either halfway through it and not yet quite complete, or they've kind of done it and it's been a bit of a disaster and they kind of want to do it again. And then on the top of that, as Ollie mentioned, there's been the need to change because of the pandemic. All of a sudden, we've got clients that are thinking about, we don't build software, but maybe we should. And do our customers interact with us through a screen? And if they do, we probably need to be thinking about software. And all of a sudden, and we've got clients that I can recently think about that have become tech companies for the first time. So all of a sudden, they've gone from 100% outsourced kind of vendor model to releasing software weekly. And of course, that changes the entire dynamic of an organization, whether it's the engineering teams, the type of people that you employ. They've got screens on the wall and observability platforms clicking away in the background. And this was alien to them maybe 12, 15 months ago. So the stats that you're seeing is basically just a bit of a kind of a confirmation and an affirmation that as companies continue to adopt cloud models, the need to have really good DevOps and good engineering capability is really paramount. And if you understand none of that, the best way of explaining it is, if you've got an iPhone and you've recently just updated to iOS 15, there's a classic example there of a company doing DevOps really well. You get the update on your phone, it validates the update before you get it, you know what it's going to fix when you get it, and then you get the update. And that's kind of a really slick process. Apple in particular really think about the way that they engage with their customers rather than the traditional model where you buy a piece of software in a box. It's a CD that you buy off the shelf, and maybe once you've bought it, you need to buy the next version in a year's time. So DevOps, and Alex mentioned, and these are sort of my thoughts, but talking to some of the clients that I'm fortunate enough to work with, we've talked about the focus on culture. We're constantly wanting to and our clients are wanting us to engage with them to say, look, we're building software for the first time, or we're not very good at it, or we've previously outsourced it. So we now need to think about how to keep 100 engineers happy. We don't really know what we're doing. So there's this focus on culture. And Alex has mentioned the notion of, a happy teams do better work. And part of that culture is the empowerment. And we'll talk in a minute about getting developers at the table right at the start of a project, but also giving them the tools and the capability to kind of build the thing. The overcoming the burden of legacy estate refers to, and we see it a little bit less now as organizations kind of move through their transformation. But the days are gone where, companies are running these huge complex applications on a server under someone's desk, and no one really knows what it does, but you can't switch it off because it will take the company down. And these organizations are kind of shackled to this complexity. And even though we see some clients still in that position, mostly they're some way through a cloud adoption or a cloud migration program. So they're not now shackled to that kind of old legacy estate. So we're starting to see them want to consider things like automation in their DevOps and applying things like artificial intelligence and machine learning to their deployment, which again, we'll talk about in a sec. And that leads me neatly onto that. So it's now these companies have got stuff into the cloud, whether they're putting stuff into containers and using orchestration layers like Kubernetes, but thinking, well, how can we do what we do quicker? And it's not to remove the engineering element, not to remove the developers, but they just need to get quicker to keep up with market demands. Alex mentioned, so I'm just kind of repeating, DevOps was such a buzzword for such a long time, and it was kind of stuffed into people's job titles, or it was just an assumed thing where you'd get your best developer and he'd just do all the things. He'd be doing the orchestration, the integration, the unit testing, and it's not really that. And there's just a few points there to think about, that DevOps is not really any of that. It's more about culture and people. So this is a really interesting thing that I've observed, and it's a quote from Jane Groll, and this is and we talked about this earlier. Historically, with projects, developers would never get engaged at the start, and that's always been a problem. And because of that, projects would always go awry. And what we're now seeing is this slow nudge into bringing developers into the project mix right at the start. And that's really important because these folk that are building the thing, they're no longer, they're starting to get a voice, because organizations, there are a number of reasons that it's happening as well. The mean average age of C-level executive suites is going down a little bit. So again, I think I was talking to a couple of colleagues earlier, but attitudes are different within organizations, not everywhere, but certainly some. So bringing developers in from the start and starting to give them a voice has been really important, and we're slowly starting to see that. And at BJSS, our discovery teams, our enabler teams, when we do a discovery, there's always a lead kind of architect and a lead engineer, and making sure that they're there up front to start having these conversations. But there's just a little interesting thing from a developer perspective too. Developers are going to have to start giving up the notion of total control over what they build. So instead of understanding every line of code and being an expert in the proprietary thing that they've built, a lot of the stuff now is off the shelf and it's all turnkey. And actually it's more about just monitoring and keeping an eye on what's going on, and actually just taking action when your software product kind of goes awry. And we'll talk about observability in a minute. So we talk about, from a DevOps perspective, kind of the comms model. And there's some elements there on the outside of the triangle. And these are, as a delivery manager, some of the important conversations that I try and have with people to kind of get them to think about how they shape their organization. And to look at it on a slide, it's all quite obvious, but when you're dealing with people, change is really difficult. So we talk about leadership from the top. And Ollie, you and I have talked about the project that you're on. It's a real challenge when you've got so many people and you've got an executive team or a team of decision makers that maybe just don't get it and just say, build the thing and just make it work. And what we try and do at BJSS is get them to understand actually what building product is and what software engineering actually needs. And it's all the things that Alex and Ollie have talked about. It's the cultural enablement. It's using technological advancements like automation. We'll talk about some of the tooling in a minute as well, but it's all those other things in the triangle too. It's empowering the team. I think we had a question earlier that we ran through in terms of How do developers get a voice? Well, this is a skill that developers are starting to have to develop, and it's being a little bit more proactive instead of just taking a spec or a requirement sheet and building the thing. By being involved up front and getting a seat at the table, all of a sudden these engineers have now got a responsibility to be part of the decision-making progress of how companies build products. And then, of course, there's the organization of how you deliver the thing and then the optimization of it. So Alex is right, you're probably not done as an organization, and it'd be interesting to see, the companies that you work for, how if you release software or product, how you think it goes and whether you think there's any kind of improvements that could be made. So it's not about the tools, it's about change. It's about the change in the world that Ollie's covered, and it's about the people. And at its heart, it really is, it's a cultural thing. So I'm going to leave you with a few, what I see as some predictions. And I think there's a lot of sort of engineers that I talk to, and we'll kind of briefly touch upon some of these. So we talked about using artificial intelligence and machine learning, and there was a recent release of, I think Azure do something called Copilot. And it's really interesting. If you're a developer, you write code and actually you write in the comments what you want the code to do. And Copilot's been looking at GitHub for like 10 years, and it's been scanning all the code that's submitted, and now it will just pull chunks of code that it guesses what you want it to do based on the comments that you write. And although there's a bit of a joke that it's cranking out like really ropey software now, in the next 5 years, that's going to be really fine-tuned. And again, it's this commoditization of software engineering, which is why observability is so important. We've talked about kind of cloud native environments and everyone kind of moving everything to the cloud. So again, these DevOps pipelines, these processes, not just engineering pipelines, but operational processes, need to be really slick. And we see the disasters all the time when a banking service falls over, or you read about something in the paper, and organizations are really under pressure now to get that right. We've talked about, and I've got a recent client that's running software for the first time. They've outsourced it previously. And one of the things I did was say on the first day, you do know you're going to be a tech company. And I nearly got kicked out the door. They had no kind of belief that they were going to be a tech company. They thought they were the company that did the thing that they do in the automotive industry. And actually, they're now releasing software on a weekly basis and having to monitor it and maintain it and employ other people to look after it. So this notion of, if you don't deliver product software already, you're probably going to need to do it at some point very soon. And therefore, all the things we're talking about tonight is really important. Some of the tooling, so observability. So going back to the conversation of engineers having this granular control over the thing they build in, and probably to some degree in the past, believing that what they're building is totally bespoke, and it was at the time. But now, because of things like Copilot and advancements in some of the open source tooling, and the way just we develop software and the microservice that we've got available, offered by companies like AWS and Azure, a lot of stuff's now off the shelf. So we're now seeing clients wanting to implement tools like Datadog and Dynatrace, and these are observability platforms that actually just monitor what's happening from an output perspective and the quality of the thing. It doesn't really matter what the thing is. And actually these applications are quite complicated. So our clients are asking us to install them because they've got the software bit right, and they've automated quite a lot, but they now need a proper view of the landscape of what's going on so they can just make course corrections when stuff goes awry, rather than having real solid engineering SMEs that need to go in, tear down the code, pull out some lines of code and rewrite it. We've got other clients, and we talk about some of the advancements in languages like Golang that have been built with DevOps in mind, so sort of really quick compiling times. And we've got a pretty big client at the minute that's implementing their development entirely in Golang, moving from their kind of on-premise, really complex infrastructure and moving it not only to the cloud, but using a language like Golang to kind of take advantage of some of the things that we've talked about tonight. And then finally, programmable infrastructure. Again, if you're kind of technologically persuaded, you'll be using cloud-based platforms anyway, but this kind of turnkey, being able to spin up environments quickly, but then having to manage that from a cost and an operational perspective. So a lot of our clients are starting to think about how and where they spend their money and making sure that DevOps has really, really done well, because otherwise you can just absolutely hemorrhage costs. So there are some of the things that we see our clients talking about and some of the conversations that we're involved in today. So I'm going to move you back over to Alex now, who's going to talk to you about a really interesting case study with the NHS.
Thanks very much. That was awesome. And yeah, I'm very fortunate enough. I wasn't actually involved in this piece of work with NHS Digital, but talking to people within NHSD and also within BJSS and Spark, I learned about this amazing piece of work that was done in the face of the pandemic and using all the ethos and tooling and frameworks that we've been talking about today. So let me tell you a little bit about it. The program name is Risk Stratification, which is not the most obvious title for something, but what it is, Oxford University had taken a lot of the data from the first wave of COVID, and of course have been iterating it through with every single item of data that they can get ever since then. And they have come up with a data-driven risk prediction model called Q-COVID. How to use that. NHSD invited BJSS to work with them and create 2 products. The first one being a clinical tool that would literally be used by clinicians, either face-to-face with a patient or when they're looking at their cohort of patients that they look after. And it's about assessing them correctly and working with that patient to get the best outcome for them. The population health tool is a wider tool, as you can probably guess, and that's looking at all the data that NHS have and using it, leveraging that to identify the people who need to shield because they're vulnerable, and then also prioritizing vaccinations off the back of that. Of course, there are applications for that with NHS resourcing and management, future prediction, because of course, with COVID-19, people are very ill, people are hospitalized, and people will die. Predicting that is really, really important to manage the NHS resources and ensure that there's the right resources in place to face these outcomes. So, how did we do it? Again, I'm going to start with the negative slightly because, consultancy, people come to us with a problem and then we work with them to sort that out. Any large organization, you'll probably recognize some of these barriers that are faced. Literally any large organization, it grows up over time. There's some of the growth is well directed, some of it's more organic. The NHS is, of course, not immune to these same barriers. So we talked before about there being a wall of confusion between Dev and Ops, but in a really big organization, you get walls between lots of different teams. So different ways of working, different requirements, different incentives. You get differences between tech stacks. Again, some of them have been built very purposefully, some of them have evolved over time. You get a lot of technical debt that builds up within those tech stacks. You get certain stacks that are more neglected than others. Some of them no longer fit for purpose. Some of them you're stuck with because that's the only thing that will run this machine that you need to use, You get onerous processes built up as well. Particularly, you get any organizer, my background is in financial services and in working with big pharma and companies like that, where these processes are there for a reason. It's partly because you've got these huge amounts of regulation. So the company is obviously going to be very conscious of that and very conscious of it in every single move they make. You get layers and layers of bureaucracy behind that, and indeed politics as well. And of course, our NHS is going to be actually literally overseen by politicians. And of course, inertia. When you think about all those barriers, it's not surprising that it's sometimes easier to not do anything. Leave it with the status quo, just sort of really, really avoid change. Inertia can be because of you're risk averse. It can be because of all these barriers I'm talking about. But it becomes then a barrier in itself. But NHSD, in the face of the pandemic, was so motivated. Of course, all that matters is saving lives. We actually had a blank slate for this. They were absolutely determined to cut through any red tape that might exist. in an incredibly impressive and forward-thinking way. So what did we make? How did we create these products? What we made was a completely new operating model, which means that we created agile teams that were able to respond to the requirements of the pandemic really, really quickly. And once you design a way of working for a team, you can then help other teams to work in similar ways. You've never used the same operating model with lots of different teams, but you only have to tweak it a little bit. We created reusable code. There's actually great big swathes of it out there in GitHub right now for anybody to use. Of course, not the data, but there are these amazing components out there with fully anonymized and obfuscated test suites, which are available now for, to benefit the world, essentially. We created reusable data access and searching methods. So the existing searching methods within the NHS, there were two big barriers. One was that you could find out who might be vulnerable. You couldn't link it to any way of contacting them. We got past that. And also, data searches were incredibly expensive, i.e. they took a very long time and used a lot of resources. And by using cohorting, the team was able to come up with a much more lightweight, much quicker searching method. They embedded monitoring security right from the start. I'll talk a little bit about how they did that in a minute. They reduced the risk of accumulating technical debt over time. And they fully realized these two pieces of tooling, which are actually suitable for other data models in the future. So how did they do it? With this opportunity, with this blank slate, they could actually come up with a new way of being. They got people in the same room, virtually. So there were people from BJSS and our design arm Spark, and people from NHSD. The moment they all got together, there were no badges. They were all one team. They were all going to work on this risk stratification project, and that was it. They established that they wanted to have complete trust. They would work in a completely transparent way, and they would all take team accountability and individual accountability, which is incredibly powerful because that then gave a basis for inviting questions, welcoming criticism, and always acting on it in a really positive way. That leads to everyone feeling fully invested and valued. They knew that every single thing that they were putting into that team was making a difference, and they were getting really good feedback about it the whole time. They started with an agreed definition of what would be done, what good looked like. And I think there was something really powerful that I think we often forget to do when we're forming a team, is that we decided complex does not mean difficult. So they were looking at this enormous project with, like I say, a lot of barriers. And literally the ones I listed there were just starting, the pandemic was quite a frightening thing. Complex was not going to be difficult for this team. And something that they included in the product team right from the start, and this is why they embedded the good practice from the start, because they had the right people in there. So they had a monitoring engineer, a Splunk specialist, because that's what they needed. They're on the first day. Same goes for test engineers, deployment specialists, the ops teams, and of course the UX and user researchers were all in there as well. So there was a full awareness of that entire product value stream right in there from the start. And something really revolutionary is that they included their stakeholders. They understood who those stakeholders were. They understood what sorts of things they might want to know, and they included them. They were actually invited to every single Agile ceremony that the team held. Of course, they didn't want to be in there at sort of 9:15 every day and see every single scrum, but they were invited and they were looped in. When you consider the sort of stakeholders they were dealing with, it becomes even more impressive. So of course, there were a lot of internal NHS stakeholders, but there were lots of different government departments who needed to be included as well. So they didn't think about it as stakeholder management. This is stakeholder inclusion. As you know, obviously, in an Agile team, you get your Scrum Master or your delivery manager. They face inwards and look after the team. They face outwards and they broadcast what the team is doing. In this case, they needed more people to do that. They couldn't just let one person do that. So they brought in a couple of other people. And they made sure that each of the government departments quickly learned that this trust and transparency was real. They learned that there would be a regular cadence of information, that they'd literally know everything that the team knew at any time. They knew exactly who to contact if they wanted an update. And that trust meant that we went from, at the beginning, you know, all these people asking questions. They didn't have to keep asking questions because they knew that the information would flow to them naturally. And they knew that if there was anything that they wanted to say in terms of feedback, it would be recorded and addressed properly. Again, transparently. When it came to the other regulators like the National Data Guardian and the Information Advisory Group, they had a slightly different cadence of involvement. Again, they were invited to all the ceremonies and they did choose to attend sometimes, but they mainly chose the best way of communication for them was to have a meeting every 2 weeks. They would give their advice, their feedback, their information. Every single thing they said was recorded and responded to properly. So every single one of these stakeholders developed and was sort of enveloped by that atmosphere of trust and transparency. And it made stakeholder management not even a thing anymore. They were just part of the thing. So the tech, I won't dwell too much on the tech because we're talking about the ideas here. And what was important, most important about the tech was that because we had all the right people in that room at the beginning, they were able to select the right tooling for them and what they wanted to do. They chose to work on AWS and using Terraform and Kubernetes. They used GitLab for their source control, and Dependabot to manage dependencies, lots of different test frameworks at the right stages in their delivery pipelines. Again, from the beginning, always embedding the testing and the quality in every single step that they did. And the monitoring, CloudWatch and Splunk were the two tools they used for that. So the most important part though, they decided as a team very quickly that what the minimum viable product for each of these two product streams would be. So what could they deliver all the way into live that would actually represent value for their end users? And they got their pipelines with the right testing embedded every single step in place right at the beginning, and they got that minimum viable product out there, demonstrable to those stakeholders within weeks from nothing. Of course, they used CI builds so that continuous integration meant that the devs were using very short-lived branches. They would do very small units of work. They would get them put in, and every time they did a build, there would be a full suite of unit tests run automatically. Then pull requests meant that there was a peer review on it. They would go through quite quickly because, of course, all the test results were there for everyone to see. Very easy to verify that the code was good. They used dynamic environments, so every time they needed to test a thing in an environment, it was spun up and taken away again quickly. So that's absolutely vital when you're using cloud resources, because the minute you spin something up, you're paying for it. So they would make sure that it was there as long as you needed it and taken away again real fast. So every single member of that team understood that pipeline and knew how to get the best out of it and kept improving it throughout. User acceptance testing at the end there. Again, they put the clinical tool in the hands of clinicians very, very quickly, and they took their feedback. They iterated that feedback in. It was always well prioritized. So a lot of their feedback they'd see sort of in the next release. Sometimes they would get the feedback that, okay, we're going to put that on the next sprint or a couple of sprints time. So again, these end users knew exactly what the response was every time they gave some feedback. And the best way to get really good quality feedback is to show the people who are putting that effort in that you are responding and you actually care. So that was absolutely awesome. So the real achievements of this team, working in very difficult circumstances, created trust, transparency, and collaboration, not just in their own team, but with government departments, very closely watching regulators and their end users. They've created these reusable outputs. So not only have they put out a lot of this code into the world to be used by anyone throughout the world, they've also created this tooling that it's not just suitable for this data set, not just for this pandemic. For instance, with a different data set, it can search for people who might be vulnerable to certain types of cancer. It can predict how it's going to go with the next horrible flu epidemic, etc. So this is stuff that's going to benefit the world for a very long time. By embedding that operability right in from the start, that means that this stuff isn't going to fall over. It means it's going to be reliable. And ultimately, the biggest achievement of it all was, of course, the lives that have undoubtedly been saved. So I kind of want to say, yay, DevOps, save lives. But, you know, there's a lot more to it than that. But I think that really does demonstrate how working in this way works. So I've talked enough about what DevOps means to me. So I'm going to hand over again to my colleagues and let them say what DevOps means to them.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Alex. That's really, really insightful. So you've kind of heard through sort of the whole panelists here, just kind of talking through kind of Ollie talking around the impact of a pandemic. We've heard sort of Alex talk around what DevOps is, and then Mario sort of covering off kind of the current state of DevOps. We've got sort of across this panel sort of a wide variety of roles, and we're just going to quickly talk around what DevOps actually means to us within our current roles. So I'm a business analyst. If you break my job down quite simplistically, it's around kind of getting requirements out of stakeholders and writing them to a state where they can be delivered. I chose delivered, not developed, because what we want to see is actually those requirements be delivered. So I could write a really good requirement. The team could kind of go through and go, yeah, that's great. You know, I can pick that up and I can write that code and it can be testable. Awesome. But that requirement's useless if it doesn't actually get into the user's hands. And what DevOps really kind of, for me, is it's an enabler to make that requirement go from a whiteboard, a sticky note, a Jira issue, or however those requirements are being gathered, developed and actually delivered, so it's actually usable. So it's around spinning up environments for developers so they're quick, they can efficiently build. Oh, sorry, just hit me there. They can kind of just quickly spin up an environment in develop, test, etc. They can kind of put it into a pipeline and it can go through its testing pipeline, and that can be quick and that can be efficient. It's then around kind of actually the route to live, which is kind of the real key here. So actually how to get through kind of it from being development to test, all through the development cycle, actually to the route to live, and that being as quick and efficient and as polished as possible. And that really for me is kind of sort of DevOps, and sort of the important part sort of from my role and where I see it is, because I can write a requirement, but if it doesn't actually get out to the users, then it's kind of irrelevant.
Cool. I'll talk about what DevOps means to me. Thanks, Kevin. So I'm going to talk about what DevOps means to me from a test perspective. And earlier, Alex spoke about the wall of confusion. And I think test can often find itself sandwiched between Dev and Ops and sort of stood on top of that wall, either waving our hands frantically or ducking and crossing our fingers. And in bad environments, I'd say bad in my opinion, development can see test as a roadblock to getting anything done, and ops don't really care about test until something goes wrong, and then they like to ask, oh, why didn't test find that? And I think most testers hopefully doesn't, but probably does strike a chord with them. I think anyone in that position has probably thought, oh, there's a better way of doing this. And I myself, I've been in that position. I've been in a position lucky enough to move from there to a place where we start introducing shift left testing, more agile approaches, 3 Amigo sessions, automation, parallelizing automation with test work, with development work rather, and alongside all of your other modern development practices, and getting to a place of an excellent culture where you've got a really cross-functional team without ego that is confident in picking things up and really respects test as a capability. However, within that engineering team, when I've been in those really good cultures, it's always felt like there was a missing piece, and this is before I've heard of DevOps. So we were very much at a place inside the engineering team where we had this DevOpsy culture without really understanding what we were doing, and feeling like there was a missing piece for the broader delivery lifecycle. And that was around the time where I heard of the Phoenix project. Read that, great book, recommend it. And I listened to a talk by Jez Humble, and he said that automation testing was the biggest predictor of success with CI/CD, and that got me interested. And I thought, this must be something to this DevOps thing. And whilst there is, and I could talk more about DevOps and testing, I think I want to focus on that culture piece and doing it in a place where maybe people aren't really familiar with DevOps, because I think DevOps can feel like this very intimidating thing where if you're not in a place to immediately implement it across that life cycle, it can feel like, oh, well, DevOps really isn't for us and we're not in a place to do that. But I think the cultural side to it, you definitely can start small. And especially as a consultancy, we're not always in a position to implement these vast cultural changes, but we generally are in a position to influence our engineering teams. And I think test is a great example of when you break down an interface and you start treating it a different manner. You can see benefits really quickly, and you can present that to the rest of your interfaces and use it as a great example. So that is what DevOps means to me.
Solly. I'll be really quick. I think we've got about 30 seconds left, but for me, it's and it's really good, by the way. Organizational empathy, right? So we've talked about it, making sure that the engineering teams understand the pressures of a business and needing to get stuff done, but also that those C-level executives and those decision makers understand the work and effort and the trials and tribulations involved in delivering good software. And I just think trying to get that right and having everyone on the same page is really important. That's what DevOps means to me.
Okay, awesome. I think that kind of brings us to the end of kind of the talk today. I think we've got a little bit of time for Q&A. So I'm just going to open it up to the room to start with. Does anybody have a question? We can't see anyone. I think we have got one online, so I'll just quickly go over to that one. Got a question from Daniel Phillips. He's talking around the outcomes of the NHS digitization. Question around how did they reduce the risk of accumulating tech debt without challenging the delivery timescales? In his experience as a test lead, there's always the pull between time versus quality.
So this team were in a very fortunate situation within the very unfortunate context that they were operating in that they had enough resources. They were given the test resource that they needed right from the start. And so, I think the other factor in there is the cost. So yes, time versus quality. Yeah, that can really be a big sort of playoff, can't it? But when you are given enough resources, because they couldn't afford to do anything that wasn't high quality, and they couldn't afford to not do it fast. So essentially, yes, they just threw enough resource at it to make that happen. And it's paid off longer term because that good quality, that good practice, that sort of advanced thinking about what could become tech debt in the future, because that's built in at the beginning, it's going to become less and less expensive to run over time. So yeah, literally just the right resources up front.
I think just a note on that as well. Can you hear me? Yeah, just a note on that as well. I've definitely been in situations where a suggestion has been, well, can we just throw resource at it and fix it? And no, you can't. But if you do it up front, like Alex said, and account for it, then yes, if it's managed. You can throw resource at it, but don't quote us if you just want to throw resource at all your problems.
Okay, great stuff. I think that's all the questions that we've got online. Is there any further questions at all in the room? Okay, we've got a question in the room.
So obviously you've spoken about all of the qualities that the different roles bring to the culture of DevOps. How can a smaller organization or one with less capacity to bring in those different resources still operate in that same manner? What's your thoughts on that?
I'll have a go. I think the smaller you are, still there's a lot of empowerment. I think you get much more flexibility, even though you might be smaller and you don't have the spending power. I think there is so much opportunity to, with open source software from a technical perspective and from kind of the council and the stuff available online, to kind of at least get case studies of how other companies have done it. I think if you're smaller, it's probably a little bit easier. And actually, you're just not constrained by some of the stuff that the bigger companies are, whether it's an operational constraint or a dictation of what software to use. I still think it's, for me, a smaller company, I think, is in a better position for sure. I mean, I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I would agree. I think when you look at those three ways Alex spoke about, rather, getting that picture of your flow, those feedback loops, there's going to be less of them, and trying to, initiating any kind of cultural change is going to be easier when you've got less people. So yeah, just agree with what Mary said.
It's just an easier problem to solve, right? Some of our clients, when we map out their process, it's like this massive mural that goes across 30 foot of paper. Whereas if you're smaller, it's just by default easier, I think. But
I think once upon a time, when I first learned about DevOps, we talked a lot about the DevOps unicorns, and those tended to be the startups, the small startups, who had essentially started doing this amazing DevOps practice the moment they learned about it. And they literally could do it because they were so small. And, we talk about agile frameworks and agile ways of working, but they were literally agile in the way, they didn't have sort of entrenched problems or constraints or anything like that. They could actually work in a new way quite quickly. And I know that, sort of following on from that, a lot of organizations thought that they couldn't do DevOps because they weren't small startup organizations, just sort of small and scrappy and just doing what probably looked to a much more entrenched and maybe sturdy company, probably thought it was impossible for them. But, year after year, that's proved to be wrong. So yeah, not all companies are in the position to throw lots of resource in, but those companies tend to have people who can wear a lot of different hats. That really helps. And, with a smaller, less complicated stream from idea to live, you can just get together to spot problems as well. So it may take you time to develop your sort of automated test suite and your automated deployments, but bit by bit, you're building it up. If you're building it up in the right way from the start, then you're setting yourself up to succeed. I hope that answered the question. Didn't just ramble on about my favourite subject.
Okay, thank you. There's no further questions online. I'm going to open it up to the room one last time. Okay. If not, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to our panelists. I think you've all done a fantastic job, and I found it really interesting. I hope everybody else has found that really interesting. So thank you very much.